If you guys haven't been to Martinsburg yet to Love Revival over there, you should go sometime. It's great. I was there last weekend. Um, well, let's get into the word together. Let's start in Hebrews chapter 4. Nah, we're going to save that for a minute. We're going to go to Mark chapter 6 instead. Let's see. Let's start in Mark chapter 6, verse 37. So this is the feeding of the 5,000, right? Um, but he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in fifties. And when he had taken 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. So the disciples were part of this miracle, right? Jesus put a little piece of bread in each of their hands, and they started giving. And when they gathered up the scraps, there was more than they had begun with. So they were right in the middle of the miracle, but there was a lesson to be learned that they actually missed. So that's what we find out when we keep reading. And the next account here is Jesus walks on the water. We'll just read that from the top here, from verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida. And while he sent the multitude away, and when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw them straining at rowing, and the wind was against them. But about the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and cried out. For they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and marveled. For they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. Well, that's weird. That last little verse right there kind of comes as a surprise. You see someone walking on the water. They're freaking out. It's a ghost, right? Not only is there a storm, and we have this story in other Gospels, so if you put it all together, you find out the storm was really bad, and they were concerned that they were going to die. And then a ghost. Oh no. Things just went from bad to disturbing. And Jesus is like, "Cheer up, it's me." And he comes and steps into the boat, and the wind stops. And and their minds are blown, right? They're all amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled. My version is minds blown. For they had not understood about the loaves because their hearts were hardened. So there was a lesson to be learned in the multiplication of the food that somehow would have helped them when they were on the sea, had they recognized what it was. You could draw a very simplistic lesson, and you could say, if Jesus is around, it's going to be okay. And that's a good lesson as far as it goes. But Jesus had actually intended for the disciples to learn something that would have helped them even when they didn't see him present. He lifted up his eyes to heaven and gave thanks, blessed the bread and the fish. And because they had just bumped up against their natural limitation, right? We don't have money to buy food for all of these people, nor is there anywhere to buy food in walking distance. And if we send them to get their own food, these people are so hungry they might pass out on the way. I'm putting all the different gospels together here to give you a bigger picture. So they're bumping up against a natural limitation, which is not enough food. And Jesus lifts up his eyes to heaven. He gives thanks for what little they do have. And he puts it in the hands of the disciples, and they give it away. And it turns out to be more than enough, right? It's multiplied. And the next thing to happen is Jesus sends them across the lake. Jesus sends them, right? They're doing what they've been told to do. They're on a mission from Jesus, and a storm comes up, and they're thinking, uh-oh, we're dead, right? The boat's going to flip, and we're all going to the bottom. And then Jesus comes walking on the water, transcending a natural limitation. And he says, don't be afraid. Or be of good cheer. It's me. And they had no way of processing what was going on. They didn't realize that Jesus was trying to demonstrate a different way of life, a way of life that transcends natural limitations. Because somehow they missed the lesson of the fish and the loaves. And it says their hearts were hardened. So if you've been around for any length of time, you may have heard me say this before, and you will hear it again. When a miracle happens, it's not God temporarily interrupting natural laws in order to do something special. Right? It's not just an anomaly, an exception to the rule. A miracle happens when the rules of God's world supersede the rules of this world. So it's not natural law being suspended, it's natural law being trumped by a greater law. The way that heaven works. So that's what we're praying for when we say, your kingdom come, your will be done. It's a big prayer, but one piece of truth inside that phrase, your kingdom come, your will be done, is God, bring the laws of your world and trump the laws of this world so that things are done here the way that you do things there. And so this is what Jesus modeled. He takes what little they have in front of them. And he lifts up his eyes and he said, you know, and he blesses what he has while he's looking beyond the limitations of the natural world and he's looking to the Father. And the disciples could have begun to catch on to the way that things actually work, but it says that their hearts were hardened. So sometimes in order to get in your head the truth that you need to know, you need to respond to what God is doing or what God is saying with a soft heart. Because a hard heart will actually prevent a renewed mind. Jesus said you have to become as little children to enter the kingdom. One of the great things about kids is they're ready to believe. And not only do they have a capacity to believe, but they actually want to. If you tell them something incredible, they'll just eat it up. I've been known to tell a few fibs to kids just for fun. But I just love the way that a kid is ready to believe something incredible. And it's that kind of a heart, a soft childlike heart that's ready to recognize what God is doing and what God is saying, and to, instead of passing, setting it aside as a one-off experience or as that's what Jesus can do when Jesus is here. It's instead, look what Jesus can do because he's looking at the Father. So there's another story about the calming of the sea, and I think it's a different event. Sometimes two gospels tell the same story, and sometimes there's multiple stories. Different event, as I recall. It's the one where Jesus is asleep in the boat, and it gets stormy, and they come and wake him up. Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing? So he gets up, he calms the storm, and then he looks back at them and goes, where is your faith? Well, didn't we do what we were supposed to do? Right? There was an emergency, and we contacted you. You are Jesus, after all. And you took care of the problem. That was success, right? We had an emergency prayer meeting. We got a hold of heaven. And Jesus is like, but where's your faith? So one of the things Jesus was trying to do with his disciples was to get them to recognize that there's another way of living that transcends natural limitations when you're living in the will of the Father and you're responding to what he's saying and what he's doing. Natural law doesn't apply. Instead, the law of the kingdom applies. So now let's go over to Hebrews 4. So the author of Hebrews is telling a story about when Israel went into the promised land, or rather when they were in the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And he's saying that though Joshua brought them to the land, there's still an invitation that comes up later in the Psalms to enter his rest. So he's saying there's still a place of rest for God's people to live, and he's trying to get the readers to catch on to this new way of living. So we're just going to go for Hebrews chapter 4, verse 6. Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience. So that this is, again, Israel in the wilderness. Some disobeyed and didn't get to go into the promised land. Verse 7, again, he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time, as it has been said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day. There remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself ceased from his works, as God did from his. Which is, of course, taking us back to the creation story. God works on creation for 6 days, and then he rests. And so he starts to interact with people, right? He puts Adam and Eve in the garden to live in the completed paradise. And somehow, when they work, they're working in the seventh day to expand God's paradise. And that place of rest is where they live and operate from and are supposed to stay there. And obviously they didn't get to stay, but that was the intention. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. So in order to enter the rest, you have to cease from your works like God did. And then it says to be diligent to enter that rest. So diligent means work hard. So work hard to stop working. Work hard to stop working so that you can enjoy a place of rest and fellowship with God. It's starting to look like a contradiction, right? How do you work on not working? Well, Jesus said it like this: this is the work of my Father, that you believe on the one whom he sent. And could it be that the people this is written to, and us by extension, have been working on getting past all of the obstacles to return to a place of fellowship with God? Right? We're trying to overcome all of our own weaknesses and limitations in order to arrive back at the place that God initially intended for us, which was a place of fellowship with him. And so maybe the working on not working is start to believe instead of relying on your own efforts. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience, since the word of God is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. So the repeated theme in the previous chapter and this one is, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts like Israel did when they rebelled in the wilderness and were prevented from entering into the promised land. And now it's saying that we can be diligent. Let's work diligently at ceasing from our own labor in order to enter into God's rest. So maybe we're switching from the self-improvement program to the trust and obey program. Over here, you have to earn your way into God's good graces and be rewarded for all of your diligence. And over here, you just go along with what he's saying and trust that he's going to get you there. I was talking about this with Priscilla last week. The fact that this passage here is not only talking about how Israel got into their promised land, but it's also talking about how Adam and Eve got booted out of their promised land, right? And there was a cherubim with a flying sword that turned all directions. A flaming sword that kept them from getting back into paradise. So now in Hebrews, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. The word of God, that is the thing that he's saying, is living and active and sharper than a sword, and is going to pierce deep enough to test the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And if you allow the sword to pierce you, that is, you listen to what God is saying and allow that to test your heart, right? Sometimes it's easier to stay away from God's voice. Maybe just live by principles and avoid relationship, because relationship introduces some variables, right? It's a little bit scary compared to the predictability of just living by what you already know. The Genesis connection gets a little stronger with verse 13. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. Just like Adam and Eve, who were all of a sudden aware that they were naked, and they went and hid themselves, withdrew from relationship. The author here is saying, allow what God is saying to test you, because God's trying to draw you back into the place of fellowship and of vulnerability, where you don't have to put a protective layer between yourself and the Lord. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So not only is Jesus calling us to live in a way that transcends the natural limitations, like no more bread, or can't cross the lake without a boat, right? He's demonstrating a better way. And not only is that true for miracles that happen externally, but also there's natural limitations that we bump into internally. And so it says here, seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens. I would like to suggest that that was a return to paradise, and Jesus was showing the way back. Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. See, we're back to talking about natural limitation and the fact that our own effort will only get us so far because we have weaknesses and we come up short on the kind of perfection that one would want to present when they come before God. But was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So, the king on the throne, the one who's qualified to judge you, is the same one who took on the human experience and was tempted in every way just like you are, yet without sin. And he's holding out an offer of grace to help in time of need. So there is grace available to transcend your own natural limitations. And not only demonstrate the miracles of Jesus, but also transcend human weakness and receive grace to overcome sin. So much so that you can come boldly into the presence of God without having to put a protective layer between you and him. So this is possible by responding to his voice. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Jesus is inviting us to come close. And if we're able to respond with a soft heart, then we can then take on a renewed mind and we can start to think like he thinks, where we're not constantly bumping up against the natural limitations of, oh, I'm just weak in that area. You know, I just always trip up there. And the Lord's like, I would really like to bring you into a place of rest, a place beyond striving. Striving against sin is a good thing to do on a bad day, right? Sometimes you got to resist. However, there is a way to transcend a natural limitation, your own weaknesses, which is to start to tune into his voice, to hear what he's saying, to respond to him. And to move past toil back into the place of rest. You remember when Adam was expelled from the garden, God said, you're going to have to sweat a lot to produce enough food. But there's a ceasing from our own labors, from our own works to be good enough, that comes from responding to his voice, where we can begin to enter into rest. So maybe the good news is better than we thought it was. Maybe Eden has been opened again, and the cost of admission is we have to listen for God's voice and allow that to test our hearts. allow that to pull out of us any intentions that are to get there by our own willpower, our own abilities, right? We bump up against natural limitations all the time, don't we? Limitations within ourselves. But the thing that can take us beyond our natural limitations is simply the thing that the Lord is saying right now. And so the exhortation, do not harden your hearts, becomes all important. God's trying to get us ready to fully inherit his kingdom. Our own holiness is insufficient. To live the way that the Lord wants for us. So if you're bumping into the same old weaknesses, tune into his voice. See what he's saying. And that flaming sword is going to do surgery on this heart. Bring a softness that God can work with. And then we can step into the place of rest where we're no longer having to strive to accomplish our own holiness, and we're no longer having to strive to bring about God's will in the world around us, but we're starting to live from a higher supply. The last miracle that happened had in it a message, a lesson to learn. What's the last miracle that you witnessed? What was the last answered prayer? What was the Lord saying through that? The disciples missed the message of the fish and the loaves. I'm not sure that I've fully got it. I've given to you the bare outlines of what I see. But I think there's more there. David said these words. He said, because I meditate on your testimonies, I am wiser than all my teachers. He paid attention to the things God was doing. Thought about all the time. And he transcended the wisdom of his teachers and entered into a higher way of thinking. It was the renewed mind before it was cool. So when God does a miracle, it's not a one-off. It's an invitation to a higher way of thinking and a higher way of living that goes beyond natural limitation and brings us into the kingdom. One of our unrenewed thought patterns is, well, if something goes wrong, I'm going to run out of money, and the bills won't get paid, and we have a tendency to worry about tomorrow. And Jesus is like, no, don't worry about tomorrow. Look at the birds. They don't have all this stockpile, but the Father feeds them. There's a higher way of living that I'm trying to bring you into. But it's going to take some childlike trust. And the two ways that we can learn this higher way of life are one, recognize what God is doing and find the message that he's trying to teach in the middle of it. Did he multiply the fish and the loaves for you? Were you witness to a miracle of some kind? Were you witness to an answered prayer? What was God trying to teach you in the middle of that? And what is he saying right now? We get a hold of this, we're going to look totally different than we look right now. I'm excited. If I was in a lot of other churches this morning presenting this message, it would not get a good reception. This is not popular, but it could be. It just needs some people to model it. What if we stopped worrying about tomorrow? Because we recognize that God provided before, God will provide again. And often what he needs from us is not enough bread and enough fish. He just needs some obedience. And maybe a soft-hearted yes. Start to recognize his way of doing things. We have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses, with our human limitations, and yet he holds out grace. So instead of shrinking back because I'm not there yet, instead we can step forward and say, Lord, here I am. I need mercy. I need grace for the present moment. We'll find that when we hear his voice, it's an invitation to come close, to receive heaven's supply, and to receive a new way of thinking that's built on trust. I sometimes go days at a time without hearing his voice. Maybe I grow a little dull. Maybe my heart gets hard. There's a lot of other inputs that are trying to tell us a very different story, that are trying to teach us the self-improvement program, or the content yourself with exactly where you are and what you have in life. You know, don't get overly optimistic or you'll just be disappointed. You know, there's a lot of other narratives, a lot of other voices, a lot of other inputs that are competing with the kingdom way, where we trust the Father and there's always enough. And our own weaknesses and human limitations are not the last word. His voice is calling us higher, up and over. And it's going to take some simplicity, some childlike trust to embrace that. So, well, that's all for today. So let's try it right now. Let's listen for his voice. If you're too grown up, you'll talk yourself out of the first thing that pops into your head. But if you're practicing some childlikeness, you'll grab a hold of it. So let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your voice. Thank you for the privilege of coming close. Thank you for grace to help in time of need. Lord, would you speak to us now? We're listening for you. Maybe you heard something, maybe not. How about this? Just ask the Lord about whatever difficult situation you're facing right now. Lord, what do you think about that? Well, if you heard something, just hang on to it. Make a little note in your phone. Place some value on what the Lord's saying. And you might feel unaccustomed to hearing his voice. I do sometimes too. The invitation is still out there. Today, if you hear his voice. And that invitation will still be there tomorrow. The possibility of hearing what he's saying and moving beyond our limitations into a walk that's so dependent on him and his ways. So, God bless you, and you're dismissed. If anyone would like prayer, you come on up, and myself, and if I can get one or two members of the ministry team to join me up here, that would be good. And, other than that, feel free to hang out.